Every once in a while, a book series comes along that one would consider genre defining. Now, what if you could also consider it genre defying, in that to put it in a box is kind of doing it disservice? One could call it a romance drama, one could call it a historical fiction novel series, one could call it a thriller series. But again, what if it encompassed all three, and much more? And what if the sequel book is as good as the first? Let's talk about The Winter of the World, Book 2 in Ken Follett's Century Trilogy. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. I'm a composer and also a booktuber. I've written music on The Wheel of Time Season 2, His Dark Materials Season 3, and the official Brent Week's companion album for a series Lightbringer. So I wanted to take this time to talk a little bit about, a book that is I'm very passionate about, and a series I'm very passionate about. I've only read the first two of the three books, and I'm talking about, of course, Ken Follett's Century Trilogy, which charts five families, a Russian family, a German family, an English family, a Welsh family, and an American family, as they're swept up in world events. And you see this family across multiple generations, from World War I all the way through the end of the Cold War. So roughly almost 100 years of history, and that's why it's called the Century Trilogy. I'm here to review The Winter of the World, book number 2. And I'm going to keep this spoiler free. I'm going to keep it spoiler free across the entire series because I think not enough people know about the series. It's criminally underrated. And the more I can kind of spread the gospel of Ken Follett and the Century Trilogy, the happier I'll be. And the happier I'm sure you'll be once you read it. So without further ado, let's kind of jump into what the series is about and kind of what this book covers. So first of all, like I mentioned, there's five families and they're swept up in world events. So the first book takes place in World War II time, and it covers the women's suffrage movement, and it also covers the Russian Revolution. The second book, this one, Winter of the World, covers World War II, the rise and fall of Hitler's Nazi Germany, and the seeds that are sown to create the Cold War. The third book, Edge of Eternity, which I just started actually, and is also fantastic in its own right, covers the Cold War up through the end of the Cold War, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in the 1990s. So really interesting kind of way that Ken Follett has weaved these historical events and had the characters in these books both be an observer and a participant. So you're actually seeing POVs on the ground floor. You're seeing, the POV of the British Army. You're seeing a POV of the German Army in trench warfare during World War One. You see certain characters get swept up in the women's suffrage movement because of kind of abuse and mistreatment that they had suffered earlier on in their lives, which kind of propelled them to action that, like, hey, women have as much rights as men do. They should be paid equally. They should be treated fairly. You see that. And then, you see in book 2, the rise of Hitler's Nazi Germany, you see people on the ground watching the Reichstag burn. And kind of the events that leads up to the Holocaust and everything. Really harrowing to read and kind of witness alongside these characters, but also fascinating because you think about history books, and usually history books kind of show the historical perspective of it. So you feel like these events happened a long time ago. I mean, you look at any, footage of World War One, World War Two, and it's all black and white, very grainy. And so you're kind of far removed from it, if that makes sense. As harrowing and disturbing as it is to watch, there's still a degree of separation. Now, with a book, reading about these events, first of all, your imagination can kind of run away with things, which is a really heavy thing to kind of experience, but at the same time, it really brings these events to life. Also, these characters being participants, both willing and unwilling participants, and seeing their kind of character arcs evolve as the historical events shape their own personal narratives is something that I thought was really interesting. You see German POVs in the first book, Fall of Giants, and they are kind of forced to fight a war that they don't really feel invested in. And then when they lose the war, they're forced to pay reparations and they lose everything. So you kind of sympathize with the German plight. And then you see the rise of Hitler's Nazi Germany, and those same characters that were POVs might either side with Hitler or be against Hitler and trying to, like, covertly bring down the Nazi regime from the inside. really interesting to see that, like, hey, the Germans' population during that time was very complex. It wasn't a black and white story. There were people who were conflicted about it. There were people who changed their minds later down the line as things became more apparent on what Hitler's kind of final solution was going to be. So reading sequels, especially where there's a continuation story and descendants of, kind of the main characters that you fall in love with, it always feels to me a little bit ham-fisted in, even in fantasy books. I kind of have a hard time kind of investing in the story because, I fell in love with the first characters. I don't want them off page and off screen, so to speak, and then just be trying to be invested in their kids, like if they're not as interesting, right? So that was something I was concerned about with the series, but I was assured that The Winter of the World matched up to the first. And I was skeptical, but as I read it, I realized why. Ken Follett did something really brilliant with this book. He didn't have the parents of these kids kind of exit off the page and just be like sidelined. They're actually also participants. They're moving up the ranks in their own maybe military or their own positions in government, or even just trying to make a better life for themselves and their families. So you kind of see those parents evolve. You see them trying to raise kids in this like crazy mixed up world of the early 1930s, during the Great Depression, the rise of Hitler's Nazi Germany. You see a German family where they're staunchly opposed to the Nazis and the kid is joining the Hitler Youth on the side. So there's a really complex family dynamic that's really explored in this book that you don't really see in both in historical documentaries. You kind of only see a very small slice of it. You may see individual interviews with people who lived during that time talking about their experiences, but you're only getting a very small cross section. So this book really covered that well. Another thing I thought that was particularly interesting actually was to see the US perspective throughout the beginnings of World War I into their final involvement with the attack on Pearl Harbor. And you kind of get to see a lot of that stuff from the ground floor. You see their neutrality, you see them not wanting to get involved, you kind of see their slow slide into the war and kind of the events that lead up to it, but you also see the mentality of the people around those events and kind of what actually ended up bringing them to that. Because after World War I, people said like never again, we don't want ever another world war, and 20 years later they're back to it. So just kind of the events that lead up to that I thought was really fascinating. And then you're seeing it from a poor Russian family, you're seeing it from an American politician's family, you're seeing it from a German's politician, but then also subverting the Nazi regime. So you just kind of see it from all these perspectives, and I thought that was really interesting. Kind of seeing the Russian side of things and Stalin's like POV actually was really interesting. You don't see it directly from his POV, but you see it from the aides that are closest to him at the time. And of course, some of the fictional characters happen to be very close to Stalin at the time. So you get to see it from their narrative. And I thought that was really interesting to see as well, because, again, in history, you don't learn as much about the inner workings of the psychology of these people. So I thought that was really cool. I would say, if I was to give a note of criticism about this book, I would say, and this is kind of a weird criticism to have, but I think like they covered a lot of the disturbing elements. Ken Follett covered a lot of the disturbing elements of that time with taste and class. I mean, even when the Russians invade Berlin in 1945, and just the horrible barbarism of acts that were committed against the women in Berlin and also just the people of Berlin, he handles it. He manages to kind of walk a fine line between kind of a brutal, heavy, disturbing narrative of the truth of what happened there, but then also, not being gratuitous for gratuitous sake, if that makes sense. So he definitely did it with taste, which is kind of a funny way to put it. But I hate it when novels try to like glorify the violence and the horrible treatment of people, like just for the sake of like some salacious kind of reading. And I just hate when that happens. So I really respect and admire Ken Follett for doing that. The one thing where I thought, things kind of felt short, and I understand it was for the reasons of the story, was, some of the concentration camp experiences weren't as well covered. And now there's a reason for that is, when you're looking at a small German family experiencing these chaotic events in Germany, but not necessarily being beholden to the Nazi regime, when you see an American family trying to, convince the president not to get into war and seeing this kind of slow backslide into war again, you're not going to see the experiences of a concentration camp survivor, because those people were not in the concentration camps. But you see a lot of these things alluded to. I think it would have been really interesting for a POV of one of the people being taken actually to one of the camps and what they experienced there. That I know it would be very disturbing and difficult to read, but I think it would have been a unique perspective of being able to understand what the mentality was. I read this is kind of a side tangent, but it kind of gives you an idea of what I mean. I read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who was a concentration camp survivor, and he talks very detailed about his experiences and what it was like to wake up in the morning, what happened, what was the daily routine, how did he kind of survive that. And, from a historical perspective and hearing his actual narration, I think it was really interesting to read, and I would have loved to see some of that tale of perseverance in this book as well. So that's my only gripe, and that's such a small gripe, honestly, because to me this is a near perfect book. If I rated Fall of Giants, the first book, as a 5 out of 5, I would probably rate this a 4.75 out of 5. It was that close. So it's when you see books like this where the descendants of the original characters you fell in love with are equally compelling, and they actually have arcs in their own right, and it's not like a fan service thing like, hey, remember that thing that happened in the first book? Like, it actually feels like it's a story that stands on its own, and yet it is inexorably tied to the first book. So like, technically, if you wanted to read The Winter of the World and just experience the World War II events, you technically could. I mean, it would spoil some of the stuff that happens in book one, but not like irrevocably. I mean, you could probably read them out of order, but I would highly recommend you read them in order because the first book is just phenomenal, and this book really matches up to that. And I was so excited. You can always tell when a book series is interesting and compelling when you put a book down and you immediately pick up the next book of the series, which is exactly what I did with Edge of Eternity. So loving it so far. I'm about like 140 pages into it, so like 10-12% into it, because these things are massive tomes. The fact that these are massive tomes are actually not a deterrent, because Ken Follett cut his teeth on being a thriller writer, and it shows, because these are perfectly paced novels. I never felt for a second that, oh, there's a section that drags, because usually with a 1,000+ page book, sections drag, but this is one of the rare ones I felt where everything had a purpose and a reason for being there. So props to Ken Follett on that. I mean, that's no small feat. So I just wanted to leave this review to gush about Winter of the World, the second book in the Century Trilogy. I really appreciate you watching, and I really hope you get a chance to check this out, because please don't sleep on it. I think, I'm so glad that I did, and I just have a feeling that this, deserves a lot more credit than it gets, because, often when people talk about Ken Follett, they talk about the Pillars of the Earth and the Kingsbridge series, which I have on deck next. Haven't read it yet, but definitely this is no slouch either. So check it out. Let me know in the comments if you've read it. Let me know in the comments if you're looking to start it, and if enough of you are down to start it, maybe I can kind of put together a Discord channel or something, do a little read along with you guys or something. I can check in every few chapters. I don't know. Let me know what you think. But thank you. That is it from me. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. Please like and subscribe if you like this video and kind of the stuff I love to ramble about my favorite books on this channel and have dialogue with all of you. So please be good to yourselves. Please be good to each other. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. Take care.